I'm happy that Daniele Chiffi is here today with us. Daniele is assistant professor now at the Politecnico University of Milan, which is basically the equivalent of ITH in Italy. More, well, actually, not the same type of standard, but it's more or less the same thing, the same idea. And he's a professor in logic and philosophy of science there. He's going to be promoted soon, I guess, to associate, right?
Yeah, so spumante.
Yeah. I know Daniele for many years now, like 10 years, something like that. Daniele actually has a background in logic and formal epistemology and philosophy of science. So he did a lot of work in his early career on non-classical logic, difficult stuff. And then he moved to a department of medicine in Padua. He started to work on philosophy of medicine, trying to apply logic to clinical reasoning, philosophy of medicine, and that is basically more or less when we met the first time. And since there we co-authored many papers together. I mean, Daniele is a publication machine. He knows how to write paper faster and better than ChatGPT, trust me. But that's true. Yeah, we did a lot of work on clinical reasoning and philosophy of medicine. Now he moved a bit the focus of his research to the philosophy of risk and uncertainty, with a focus not only on medicine, but also on natural sciences and engineering and urban studies. Yeah, and more recently, he moved his focus also to AI, because everyone does that. So this tells you also something about the wrong direction that academia is taking. And yeah, and today he's going to talk about trust and risk, the case of mHealth apps. So Daniel, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mattia. Thank you for the kind invitation. I'm really pleased to be here. And yeah, of course, yeah, if something is not clear, please stop me. And yeah, just a seminar we can discuss really. So basically, yeah, what I've been doing is in the recent past to apply some knowledge and risk analysis to fields like technology, philosophy of technology, philosophy of medicine. And what I noticed is that these two fields didn't communicate one with the other. And so my idea was to try to reconnect and to use some methodologies used in other fields that can be meaningfully applied also in the context of technology, in the clinical context, and context of medicine. Of course, it's not just an issue of applying blindly methodologies or other fields to medicine, but of course we have to adapt things. But I will try to convince you that with some modification, this is feasible in a sense. So basically today's seminar is split in two parts. In the first part, I will draw mainly on my research on risk in philosophy of technology and on some papers that I recently wrote on the philosophical foundation transport AI. And then, yeah, what I will try to do today is try to see if I can find some suitable application of this theoretical framework that I have developed. Sometimes, you start with your research, starting with some very theoretical, fascinating, very general ideas that you are looking for some applications. Then you discover that, yeah, there's no application. Basically, I hope that this is not the case, but it's possible. In other cases, the process is different in the sense that you have some ideas on some contextual area, then you want to try to abstract some common principle in order to come up with a better framework, a better conceptual framework. So basically, the first part of the talk will be a bit more conceptual, a bit more philosophical oriented. The second part will be a bit more applicative. And yes. Okay, so trust and risk, the case of mHealth apps. In particular, I will focus on the apps used for diabetes, and we will discuss about this in the second part. Okay, so the plan for today is the following. So as I was saying, I will start introducing the conceptual framework on trustworthy AI. As you know, there's a lot of talk regarding trustworthy AI, what is trust, this kind of things. So with my colleagues, we take a stance on the issue pertaining to trustworthy AI. I will try to show you what we have done in this. Then I will properly introduce to this general philosophical framework that we are trying to develop with my colleagues. A general framework for trust and risk in artificial intelligence. I was quite lucky because when this paper got published, it was really the days in which the Artificial Intelligence Act was finally approved. So basically, it was quite lucky. So this means that, yeah, the issue of risk is something which is very important, not just at philosophical level, but also at a level that regulatory level, of course, in particular in the European Union. Then I will try to use this general framework in order to provide some initial insight on how to evaluate risk and trust in case of diabetes mHealth hubs, and then we try to do some final conclusion. So that's what we are going to do. As I was saying, this is not just a work that I've done alone, it's work that I've done with my colleagues at Politecnico di Milano, namely with Professor Viola Schiaffonati and Giacomo Zanotti. With them, I have developed the general framework, as I was saying, and then with Stefano Canali and with Sophie Materne, we are trying to apply this general framework to some specific medical technologies, basically. So I'm kind of union between these two groups. The idea is try to find some nice application. And why I'm interested in trustworthy AI, one reason is also because a national project has been funded and a part of the research team, and the project is called BRIO, which means bias, risk, opacity in artificial intelligence, design, verification, and development of trustworthy AI. And so we had, I think, one of the few projects in 2020 on the philosophy of artificial intelligence by the Italian government. Okay. Okay, we can properly start. And again, if something is unclear, please stop me. And okay, I'm not really good in this hybrid mode in which I have to be online and in presence, so I apologize for this. Okay, so yeah, let's start with some trivialities. Okay, what are artificial systems? What stands for? Of course, we know there are a lot of definition. I'm not going to repeat all this definition regarding AI that you all know. Of course, we use AI for communication, in medical context, for in the context of robotics, in law, or for instance, think about the increasing role of artificial intelligence for basically self-driving cars. I've been working on that as well. So basically we use, as you know, artificial intelligence system in many critical contexts. And it's very likely to assume that in the future, this will be almost always true, in the sense that artificial intelligence will be very purposeful, in a sense, or other technologies that now we cannot even imagine that can help us to deal with that. As you might know, the issue of trustworthy AI is not just an issue which pertains to philosophers, to people that works directly in the technology, in the design technology, but governance is also of the technology is something extremely important when we refer to trustworthy AI. We know there is this ethics-based regulation for the artificial intelligence, for instance, the recently approved Artificial Intelligence Act, and also the older document regarding the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence and the regarding the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. So it's not just something that on which, you know, philosopher or people interested in the design and technology are interested, but it's something that also regulators are interested, and this is quite important, I think. Okay, let's start with the conceptual part. Okay. I will start with this quote from Thomas Metzinger. Metzinger was one of the guy who made the report on the trustworthy AI document to the European Union. And yeah, you know, when the first time we read this line, we were a bit shocked because this line was written by one of the guy who wrote the European document on the trustworthy AI. So we were a bit shocked about this. So according to him, he said, okay, and of course this is the view of other scholars as well. Trustworthy AI story is a marketing narrative invented by industry. The underlying idea of a trustworthy AI is first and foremost a conceptual nonsense. Machines are not trustworthy. Only humans can be trustworthy or untrustworthy. Okay, it sounds a bit funny, but you know, this is the take of this colleague, a German colleague, I think. Generally speaking, you know, when we speak about trust, we have in mind a notion which is relational. So we need at least two agents, and there should be a relation between these two agents. And this relation is, you know, an instance of a trust relation, usually. Of course, when we use the adjective trustworthy, we are more likely to speak about a property. You use an adjective, of course. Our main focus will be on trust, but of course, we need to keep in mind that trustworthy is the adjective, and so it's a property, while trust is a relation, of course. Okay, so being trustworthy, so trust is a properly relational notion, while, you know, being trustworthy, so deserving trust, is a non-relational notion. And, you know, almost always trust is assumed to be based on reliance. We will talk extensively about this notion in a moment. And you can find many interesting definitions of this notion. For instance, where X is a person, artifact, or natural process, and phi is an action, behavior, or process. To rely on X to do phi is to act on the supposition that X will do phi. So the idea is that all those technical issues regarding the reliability of the system, all those issues regarding the accuracy in the prediction of the system, all those things which are almost always related just to the design and the working of the system, in particular in a technical sense, is what we should consider as reliable. Needless to say, if our artificial intelligence system is not reliable, we might be very reluctant to think that that system is trustworthy. Okay, it seems to be a first step, something, a necessary condition for talking about a system to be considered trustworthy. And what I will try to convince you is that reliance, in a sense, is not enough in order to properly speak about trustworthiness. Of course, there is disagreement in the literature. First of all, what does it mean, trust? What are the necessary features that someone or a system has to possess in order to deem trustworthy? There's a lot of disagreement regarding this thing. And almost always is assumed that someone is trustworthy only if, you know, this person, this system, they have the right motivation, interests, and moral obligations. Okay. In a review that we have made recently, we define this group of scholars talking about motivation, interest, and moral obligation for trust. We label this view as the motivational account. So in order to have trust, you need to have, motivation, interest, and moral obligation. And those who are really into this motivational perspective, almost always they tend also to consider reliance as a necessary but not a sufficient condition for trustworthiness. It's clear up to now. Okay, prima facie, everything seems nice. Okay, it's important that the system works perfectly from a technical perspective. It's important that, for instance, the user of the technology or the artificial intelligence systems can come up with some beliefs that guarantee him the fact that, or her, the fact that the system is working properly. Is that enough just to say that the system, is trustworthy? The answer to this question, as I will try to convince you, for me is no. But I will address the main question in a moment. We will just focus on other small steps in order to make you better understand my point. In the literature, we find, and please let me know if you are telling things that you already know very well, I can skip, of course. Yeah, please let me know. Quite standard in the literature to have an objection, even supported by some friends of mine. So in this case, I'm talking about some friends. And they have we have been discussing about this, and also in front of some beers, but it doesn't matter. And this objection to the idea that basically trust can be applied and attributed to system goes in the following way. This objection is usually reported in the literature as the conceptual nonsense objection. So basically the idea is the following. An entity or an agent X is trustworthy only if X has the right motivation, goodwill, and or adheres to moral obligation towards the trustor. Artificial intelligence systems like motivation, goodwill, and moral obligation, in the sense that they are not humans, they are agents, but they are not human agents with motivation, ethical obligation, and so. Therefore, artificial intelligence system cannot be trustworthy. That's the main objection you find. I report just 3 papers here, which present more or less the same objection. But if you dig into the literature, you will find other papers more or less saying some variants of this objection. Of course, if you have just a very practical take on trustworthy AI, so okay, why we need to care about this conceptual nonsense objection? What I will try to convince you in the second part of the presentation is that having clear ideas regarding how to define trustworthiness, reliance, and so may have also some practical benefits when we apply this. That's the purpose of today's presentation. Okay, so basically the idea is that if you buy this conceptual nonsense objection, we can, strictly speaking, attribute trustworthiness to artificial intelligence agents as we do with humans usually. And in the literature, almost always you find these other 2 objections which are added to the main objector that I've just presented. Of course, the first one is very standard one. Of course, strictly speak, even if we speak about responsible AI, of course, stricto sensu, responsibility, needs to be attributed at the last step to some humans, basically. So that's why one of the main problems in the philosophy of technology is exactly the responsibility gaps that there might be. And of course, the issue of responsibility, almost always, if you want to have this dense notion of trust, also responsibility is might be one of the moral responsibility might be one of the main ingredients of the notion of trust. And so if you cannot attribute responsibility to artificial intelligence, that can be problematic to speak about trustworthy AI, for instance. And another issue is, which is connected, is the idea of anthropomorphism. Namely, it seems that we are attributing human feature to some system that in the end are not human. So we are, in a sense, doing a kind of a categorical error here. We are attributing things that usually we attribute to humans to machines, and we don't want to have that. Okay, let's start with, when we made the review of the different perspective on trustworthy AI, we consider also another category of papers that we label as the epistemic accounts of trustworthy AI. And according to these scholars, basically, trust and trustworthiness cannot be applied to artificial intelligence system on the basis of their performance and the technical performance, and on the basis of the justification of the beliefs of the users regarding this technology. For instance, in this context, trust, for instance, in particular in medical AI, is being characterized as simple reliance. So the system works in an efficient way. So the type 1, the type 2 error are quite low. For imagine that your medical device is designed for diagnostic purposes. For instance, you want to be sure that the errors of the system are very low, and so that the results are accurate in the sense that we can rely on the system. That's why we talk about reliance. And in a sense, if the clinician keep on using the system, then the reliance becomes almost something automatic. Okay, and say, okay, this device is working efficiently, and so the clinician may rely on what the system is performing. Okay, it's a more phenomenon that depends also on how many times you use the system. So basically, the idea is that according to these guys, trust is mainly reliance plus, the monitoring, the beliefs of, in this context, of the clinician that has to make sure that the artificial intelligence system is working properly. Is the prediction that he or she is gaining are accurate. Okay, so of course it's not just initial reliance; it's reliance plus the beliefs of the clinician. That's why we turn this perspective the epistemic account of trustworthy AI. And you see, strictly speaking, we are not talking about ethics at all here. It's just an issue of, yeah, of course, indirectly, yes, we are talking, because if the predictions are not accurate, then of course there are ethical issues for the patients and for the doctor, of course. But the main focus is not on ethics at all, on motivation, goodwill. The main focus is on technical reliance, on the proper functioning of the system, and on the beliefs of the clinician, in this case, regarding the correct functioning of the device. That's why we term the epistemic accounts or trustworthy AI. Okay, of course, there are other options in the literature that can be difficult to encapsulate in the motivational stance or in the epistemic stance, an epistemic account of trustworthy AI, but most of the papers that we read in the review can. but not all of them, of course. There are some scholars which have some much more original views on trustworthy AI, and it can be a bit difficult to encapsulate. So it's not a extremely complete distinction for every perspective on trustworthy AI, but many different perspectives can be encapsulated under these two labels. And of course, we're seeing that there are some objections, theoretical objection to trustworthy AI, why we should attribute human feature to systems that are not human, and so on. And this is complicated. It seems that if you buy an epistemic perspective, reliance is very important, but what is really that contribute to switch from reliance to trust is just given by the beliefs of the clinician in that case. We want to do something different, and then we propose a way to, try to provide some objection to some answer to the objections that I just presented, and to provide you a different take on the notion of trustworthy AI. So the point is how we can meaningfully use the notion of trustworthy AI without incurring in some of the objection that we have just seen. That was the main objective. With this, we switch to the second part. Okay, just to recap this first part, basically we can distinguish at least two big perspectives on trustworthy AI. One that we label as motivational account, which says that, okay, it's important that the AI system works properly, so reliance is still good, blah, blah, blah. But what really matters is, that ethical issues, motivation, goodwills are involved. Otherwise, we can properly talk about trustworthiness. And epistemic account in which they don't have, strictly speaking, a direct ethical view on trustworthy AI, but which try to provide the basis for an epistemic reading of trust. The second part, this is what I'm going to present you, is now something that I recently published with some colleagues on artificial intelligence and society, and then we try to do some, let's say, some reverse engineering. So let's try. We wanted to know, okay, but in the end, why we want to use the notion of trustworthy AI? What are the advantages to have this? And in a sense, can we analyze the concept? The analyzing concept is a traditional methodology in philosophy. Maybe when there's confusion of things that are not so clear, can be a good thing to address the problem, basically. And we have done this, first of all, on the notion of trustworthiness, and then also on the notion of risk, as I'm going to show you in a moment. Okay, one of the practical reasons for being interested in the notion of trustworthy AI is, of course, due to the ethics guideline for trustworthy AI. If you read that document, of course, it's a legal document, first of all. So basically, it's an ethical document which was thought in order to provide some kind of orientation to governments, right? And you can feel that. It's not just an ethical document. But of course, if you have a look at that document, we will have some principles that are explicitly stated there, and you will find, okay, nothing so innovative in the sense. You will find things like respect for human autonomy. Okay, yes, we know. We are in the bioethical community, so we know. So respect for freedom, autonomy, humans must maintain self-determination, no deception, the usual standard bioethical things. Prevention of harm. So AI systems should neither cause or exacerbate harm. They must be safe and secure as much as possible. It's interesting to note that in ethics, we talk about prevention of harm. In risk analysis, usually it's very unlikely that we talk about harm, we speak about hazard. Because we are not just interested. Harm is when there is already something that has gone negative and you have some damage already. Hazard is a potential source for harm. Okay, so in risk analysis, we are interested also not just on harm, but also on the potential sources for the harm. And then of course, fairness and explicability. All these are the principles that you find in the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, nothing new under the sun. But it's important for my discourse in the sense that that's a clear indication that you need to encapsulate some ethical principle in your notion of trust. And I think that this is convenient from the perspective of the governance, but I think it's very AI, but I think it's also convenient for an ethical analysis and for a more philosophical analysis of trust in AI. And of course, if you focus on some specific issues, like for instance, bias in AI, on the one hand, it's a technical issue. Of course, bias can be a systematic error that occur, it may occur also at the level of the design system, but of course, bias is also something that already exists in the way in the world in which we live. And so some of the bias that we experience in our daily life are somehow projected also in the system that we construct. So, bias can have also a huge ethical impact on this. And also, I will be very brief on this. And then also, if you focus on ethics guidelines, you will find a switch from the aforementioned principles that we've been discussing before to some specific requirements, more stringent requirements that artificial intelligence system in general, not just for medicine, should have. And so we have accountability, privacy, transparency, discrimination, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, among these requirements, there are also those requirements pertaining technical robustness and safety. And in a sense, this is what we have in mind usually when we speak about reliance. So it's really the technical side of the trustworthy AI. Okay. So the main thesis for today is that a trustworthy AI system, as also done in the European document, is not just a system which is technically reliable in the sense that provides correct prediction, recommendation, decisions, in the sense that it's accurate, but also something which, and this is exactly technical robustness and safety and more, but we are also interested in all the other aspects, requirements which have a more ethical side. Okay, so in a sense, I'm much more sympathetic with the motivational account rather than with the epistemic account regarding trustworthy AI. And I think this is particularly true in the context of medical AI system. Okay, we all know that AI systems are not ethically neutral, and this is important. That's why I'm much more sympathetic with the motivational account. But at the same time, I think that trustworthy AI should encompass, in a sense, reliance, reliability. So even if you have a system which perform goods under your favorite ethical theory, but it doesn't work properly, then of course it's not a system that can be considered trustworthy. So the technical requirements, of course, are fundamental, but the idea is that they are not sufficient. Okay, and okay, so basically, I want to go beyond the reliability and accuracy, but at the same time, we want to avoid the conceptual nonsense objection that we've seen at the beginning. Okay, and there are at least two ways that can be considered. The first one, and it's the one that I'm going to discuss with you, is understanding whether the trust between H stands for humans and AI for the system, basically. The idea is that whether the trust between human and AI should be modeled on interpersonal trust. So the idea is the trust between me and Mattia the very same as the trust between me and an artificial intelligence system? And so the issue is they are completely different. So on the one hand, we can say, okay, we can buy a very broad sense of trust in which you can bring the relational trust between me and Mattia and the relational trust between me and the artificial intelligence system, but maybe it would be a bit too much general, and it would be difficult to take into account the specificity of interpersonal trust and trust with the machine. So we prefer to do the other way around, namely to find some commonalities between interpersonal trust, so HH trust, we call it, and HAI trust, so the trust between a person, a user, and a specific artificial intelligence. And try to understand what are the commonalities. Because if you have some commonalities, then it may have sense to keep on talking about trustworthy AI. If they are just two completely disjunct notion, that it's it's conceptually difficult to keep on speaking about trustworthy AI in a sense. Okay, then there is another possibility, at least, which we have developed in another paper, but it's a possibility that I don't like too much, in the sense that the idea is the following, in the sense that, okay, when we speak about trustworthy AI, we are talking in a loose way. We are using it as a metaphor, okay? With some colleagues, we have wrote a paper on this, but it's more on philosophical language, and I think it's not so interesting in this context. But the idea is that in some cases, we might say that we have some loose talking, saying, okay, we are not literally talking about trust, but we are just, in this case, using it as a kind of metaphor. I don't like too much this perspective, but if you want, it's still something that you can explore, but it's a bit boring then, because you have to encounter things like what is a metaphor, these kind of things, which require some linguistic competencies. But I don't think that it's really a good way to treat the issue. So basically, what we try to do is to distinguish trust in AI system, HAI, and the idea was that this first sense of trust was to capture features such as respect for human autonomy, algorithmic transparency, fairness, all those things that basically you encounter in the ethics guidelines or on some ethics paper talking about trustworthy AI. And distinguish it from the interpersonal trust, which has to do with the trust is interest, the motivation, and the moral obligation. But why we keep on referring to trust in both cases, do that, and I think that this is the reason why. The reason why is that we assume that there are some commonalities between these two notions that help us to find a core of the notion of trust that can be applied to these two different situations. In a sense that in both cases, I need to, for trust, I need to rely on some kind of reliability. Imagine that Mattia asked me if he can use my car, so I should rely, in a sense, on Mattia's skills in driving my car, knowing that he knows how to drive a car, knowing that he doesn't have bad intentions with my car, so I have to rely on you in the sense. There are some, that's a basis of reliability. So you need to be reliable. You know how to drive the car. And in the same way, more or less, also we want our artificial intelligence system to be reliable, in particular regarding the accuracy and for the prediction and so on. Then we want to have an ethical dimensions. I was saying, if I give the keys of my car to Mattia, I want Mattia to not to do bad things with my car. So I want to be, I want him to be a good guy. So there is an ethical dimension in that. And of course, when we talk about artificial intelligence systems, also we have some ethical issues pertaining the notion of trust in that case, which of course are different. We are not too much interested in the responsibility in that case, but we are interested in other aspects, ethical aspect pertaining to the artificial intelligence, trust in the artificial intelligence system. And then finally, this is a kind of conceptual analysis of trust. Every time I need to, almost all, anytime is too strong, but let's say almost always when I have to trust someone, this means that, I might be vulnerable. And there might be a situation of risk. There might be a situation of risk if I give the keys to Mattia, because there might be an accident with a car, or you can go away from Milan and just I see my car here parked next to the apartment and things like that. And of course, an issue pertaining risk, vulnerabilities are also at stake when we focus on trust on artificial intelligence system. Of course, it doesn't mean that they are exactly the same. In the context of interpersonal trust, what really matters are motivation, interest, moral obligations. And in the context of AI trust, what is really, really important there is the autonomy, transparency, the fairness, and so on. Of course, there are differences, but nonetheless, there are some commonalities. In both cases, there's a basis for reliance, for reliability. There is an ethical dimension, and in both cases, trust can be viewed as a kind of guarantee for the risk or for the vulnerability that I might face. And this means that even if, you cannot unrestrictedly talk about trust in both cases, you can specify the different senses of the notion of trust. And the good news is that there are some commonalities which may help us to properly speak also of AI trust, so the trust between humans and the artificial intelligence system. So this is a kind of conceptual reconstruction that we have been doing. And it's interesting because this also allows us to create a connection with another issue which is particularly relevant nowadays in philosophy of technology and philosophy of AI, and which is associated to other European documents, in particular the Artificial Intelligence Act. As you might know, as you know for sure actually, we have a classification of artificial intelligence risk based on artificial intelligence system that may provide just minimal risk, for instance, some spam filters, some simple video games. Then we have what is called limited risk, deepfakes, chatbots, then high risk, and unacceptable risk. I don't like particularly because, if you see minimal, limited, high, it seems something that is about measuring the risk. And then unacceptable is not anymore on the side of measuring something, is on the side of the fact that you don't have to accept, Of course, the ratio is that if a risk is very high, then it should be unacceptable. But things might be much more complicated because when you perform a risk analysis, it's also important to consider the benefits as well as possible. And so you can face some situations which are particularly complex. Okay, but still, it's very important. There's been this regulation, and I really appreciate the effort to rely on the notion of risk. Risk can be intended in many different ways, in different disciplines. Sometimes, even within the very same discipline, you can have different connotation of this notion. A very common way to talk about risk, which is also reported in the Artificial Intelligence Act, is the following. Risk is the combination of a probability of occurrence of an hazard and the severity of that hazard. So how much likely is that there will be an hazard, a negative situation, and what are the expected consequences? So this means that imagine that an event is very rare, but with high consequences, highly severe consequences, then this is assumed to be equal to an event which is much more frequent, but with mild negative consequences. Okay, this is a way to put together at least two things together. How much likely is an event to occur, and a scale of the consequences together. And then you apply standard expected utility, and then you get probabilistic view regarding risk. So is the expected value. So usually is the expected value of a negative event. And of course, it's always important to say which is the time lapse, okay? Because without that, it doesn't make much sense to talk about risk. Because, of course, my risk of dying in 2 years is different from my risk of dying in 100 years. Okay, this is quite standard. What we have done recently, you find something like that a bit just in community medicine, environmental medicine, but not too much in clinical medicine, I should say, is to have a look at the notion of risk, which can be useful, in particular from the perspective of regulation. And in particular, we talk about risk of the population, and not the risk of a single person, for instance. This can be a good way to approach risk. And this is quite standard for a natural risk disaster. So we want to evaluate the impact of an earthquake, of a tsunami. Usually the models are used in distinguishing the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability. So basically, risk is considered in this case not just as the probability of a negative event evaluated for the consequences, but it's considering in the following way, is just the result of what? Okay, so the hazard. For instance, if it is an earthquake, it's the magnitude of the earthquake. Then the exposure. So how many people live in that area? It's an earthquake that occurred during the day, during the night, during the week. So, and this may have an impact. And of course, if there is an earthquake in Milan, it's different than having an earthquake in the Sahara, because basically, there are no assets, no people exposed to the. So that's why it's very important to consider the exposure. And then, of course, the vulnerabilities. Namely, the vulnerability is the circumstances that make people or assets more or less prone to be damaged. For many natural disasters, you cannot do anything to reduce directly the hazard. I cannot do anything. We cannot, unfortunately, we cannot do anything to stop an earthquake to occur. Natural earthquake, of course, not artificial earthquake. But we can do a lot of things regarding exposure. We can do a lot of things regarding vulnerabilities, so we can make building much more robust. And it's interesting that in the technological case, with artificial intelligence, it's interesting because we can mitigate the age. We can also mitigate the potential harm. That's very interesting. That's a thing that, that's one of the main differences with the natural hazards, in the sense that natural risk, in the sense that for many natural risk is difficult or impossible to reduce the hazard. For technological risk, we can. And there is also the interesting case of natural risk interacting with technological risk, so-called natter risk. Imagine a tsunami which destroy, for instance, a factory or a nuclear power plant, as it happened in Fukushima and things like that. Of course, if H is 0, then, or E is 0, V is 0, then, of course, the risk is 0. So if there is an earthquake, but there is no people there, so if the current is Sarah, then the overall the risk is 0. Okay, and there are, in other fields, there are models to, assess the hazard, model to assess the exposure, and in particular, model to assess the vulnerabilities. Of course, not usually we are quite good in measuring the hazard. The vulnerabilities can be a bit more difficult. The exposure, the line of principle should be the easiest one, but talking with my colleagues at Politecnico, they told me that it's also quite challenging to measure. And it can be challenging also because it's very unlikely that we have just point-like value for H, E, and V, in the sense that there might be uncertainties involved. And one of my main research topic is exactly uncertainty. Okay. Okay, so basically, I'm going to say a few words just for the, maybe I will be talking too much on the concept, sorry, for the conceptual framework. The idea was, okay, this is the conceptual framework that we have created, conceptual framework for trustworthy AI, distinguishing interpersonal trust from artificial intelligence, human trust, and buying also a view of risk that can encompass the exposure, the hazard, and the vulnerability. This view on risk is particularly welcome, I think, because usually politicians likes it, because if there is a risk, they can understand what they have to mitigate in order to reduce the risk. Shall I mitigate the hazard? Shall I mitigate the vulnerabilities? Shall I mitigate the exposure? And so we have some initial practical guidance on how to mitigate risk. Now, what I'm talking now is more ongoing research. We try to understand the role of risk and trust for those mHealth apps which are used for diabetes. We all know that, of course, there are two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. I assume everyone knows that, so I'm not going to say much about that. And it's interesting to say that there are at least two main categories of apps. We selected this field because we think that given the nature of this app, the role of trust is very crucial for patients using these apps, because they have to check the glucose and things like that. So if you are just interested on mHealth apps for general well-being, trust will be much more complicated to evaluate, I think. And almost always we have two main categories of apps. We have some general self-monitoring apps, which are also called advanced diabetic diaries. And so they have some blood sugar logs, medication diet tracking, even if they're not always compatible with the continuous monitoring of the glucose. But they are the new wave of the apps that you can find. So they are used for patients with diabetes to, evaluate the trends and see how to modify their lifestyle based on glucose and things like that. And then there are other apps, not all of them are based on artificial intelligence, I should say, which are really used for a continuous glucose monitoring. Okay, and you know, they provide real-time monitoring without a finger stick, basically. These are the two main categories of apps. And, you know, there have been some recent achievement. For instance, in 2018, we have the Guardian Connect system has been launched as the first FDA certified smart monitoring. Then we have the first artificial pancreatic apps in UK in 2020. So a lot of research and technology applied to diabetes, and I'm sure you know better than me, has been developed. Yeah, I'm going to just a few slides. So basically what we are doing, we want to do, we haven't complete actually this work, is to, you know, remain stick to the ideas that trustworthiness extends beyond mere reliance, in the sense that reliance is, of course, necessary for trust, but it's insufficient for establishing trustworthy AI-based healthcare applications. So I think that it should be also a message that should be incorporated for this kind of technology. Of course, technological robustness and the safety form the foundation of reliance in mHealth apps, including the accuracy of algorithm and the resilience to some potential failures. And has been extensively reported in the literature that unfortunately current diabetes mHealth apps face technical challenges, including software glitch, battery limitation, and functionality issues that impact base reliability. I should say that this is particularly true for the new class of apps, because usually the one with glucose, continuous glucose monitoring are based on Bluetooth technology. So if internet is not working, it's not a big issue, but the more complicated app required internet connection. And so if you are in a situation in which it doesn't work internet, or you are in a rural area, this can be a bit complicated, of course. And we propose that a way to analyze, again, the potential risk associated to this technology is, again, to rely on the distinction that I just presented. Namely, okay, let's understand what are the potential hazards, which, you know, I must say, I thought that were even much more severe when discussing with some patients which daily use the apps. They told me that the apps which are really important, namely the one based on continuous glucose monitoring, works with doesn't require the internet, but just a Bluetooth. And so they told me, okay, but if it's even the Bluetooth is not working, I can prick my finger and it's not a big issue. Things are a bit more complicated for the new generation of apps, which pretend to do a lot of more things. But it's also true that, you know, the risks are not so severe as the one with the glucose monitoring. So it's kind of balance that you have there. And again, if you focus on vulnerable population, of course, we need to take into account elderly people, children, and those with low socioeconomic status, or people that may lack technological literacy. So there are the class of vulnerable people. And another interesting thing is that even if we have very efficient apps and, you know, they really works efficiently, the problem is, the issue is that there's a very high exposure. There are more than 46 million diabetes mHealth app installed worldwide. It's a lot of people that use this. And so, you know, even even if at the level of population, the risk can be negligible, there might be a few cases among this great amount of people that use the app that may face severe risk. Okay, and that's important in order to consider. And I think that having this way to address risk is important because it means that, okay, what we have to work on in order to mitigate risk is on the exposure, it's on the vulnerabilities. Maybe we need to educate much more people. It's on reducing the hazard, for instance, at the level of design. For instance, it's very common to speak about of ethics by design. Of course, ethics within the design system, it's extremely important, but that's just one step of the life of technology, because it's very important the use also. And only if you focus on the use, it's clear that, okay, look, your app is going to be used by millions of people and very strange things may happen. So, even, a spam folder, which doesn't work properly, can provide at individual level very severe risk. Even if, at the overall population level, at the overall population level, talking about risk of the digital, that's a nice example, by the way. Okay. And almost always, if you read the literature on these apps, almost always the issue is patient autonomy. Because on the one hand, there are strict clinical regimes, and in some cases, it may not fully align with the patient's self-determination, but it's a bit difficult to say. If you have a very specific clinical regimes to follow with the glucose, which is the connection with your autonomy. In some cases, I can see. In other cases, it can be much more complicated to navigate this complex relation between these things. Then, of course, I buy the view that trustworthy AI should consider the standard bioethical principle that we use. And another important thing is that some of the components of risk that we've seen before, in some cases, can be measured. And in a sense, relying on risk can be also a way to resuscitate a more consequentialist perspective. And I think in bioethics when applying this context, because having a strict focus on risk and of course on benefit, this may allow you to engage in a more consequentialist perspective. Of course, there are limitations also on the consequentialist perspective because, in particular, in medicine is the realm of uncertainty, and having a consequentialist account with uncertainty can be quite complex. But uncertainty is a problem also from a perspective based on principle as well. Of course, I'm just going to conclude. So. Just to conclude, trustworthiness requires considering the complete socio-technical system in which the mHealth apps operate, not just the technical design. So I'm not really a supporter of the idea of ethics by design. That's it. So I'm really interested in the role of ethics across all the cycle of the technology. Of course, there might be situations in which there might be over-reliance on the apps, and this can create problematic dependencies. It's very important, as I was saying, that a complete assessment of the trustworthiness must evaluate the entire lifestyle of the mHealth apps, including human interaction, also some issue pertaining to sustainability. And, for instance, you can have a look at this document that Mattia, we were discussing about this some weeks ago, this document of the FDA regarding the artificial intelligence and medical products. So the true conclusion, so the first take-home message, I'm talking too much, sorry. So trust goes beyond the reliance, technical reliance. I really try to have convinced you that we need to have an ethical take on trustworthy AI if we want this concept to be conceptually clear and operative. It's important to distinguish different forms of trust, but we have to admit some commonalities, and this allows us to properly speak and to provide a conceptual answer to the objection to the anthropomorphism and the categorical error of applying trustworthiness to artificial intelligence. One of the components of trust is reliance, ethical consideration, but also risk. I propose to have a look at risk not just in the probabilistic terms, as is quite standard in clinical medicine, for instance, but also from a community perspective, in which risk is the result of the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability. The principle that has been much more investigated in the literature of the mHealth apps is autonomy, even if I think that it's not just the issue which is more complicated. I think there's also issue pertaining risk are also relevant to be investigated. And as I was saying before, and this is coherent with the indication of the FDI, it's really important to provide a comprehensive and global evaluation of the technology. And this can be done if we just not focus only on the design of the technology, but if you can start considering the whole socio-technical system in which the technology, but also the humans operate. I've been talking too much, sorry. And these are some publications. Yeah, too much, sorry. I apologize for this. And these are some publications that I will be working on in the recent past. Grazie. Thank you. Talking too much, I'm really sorry. No worries.
Thank you very much. It has been absolutely exciting to hear all this. Just being conscious of everyone's time, I will directly open up for questions. Also, people online, feel free to unmute or write in the chat.
Please.
So first of all, thanks a lot. Being a philosopher, I really like the first conceptual part.
Okay.
Also nice to have a refresher on literature on trustworthy AI. I wanted to push back a bit on this question as to whether we need the notion of trust in the first place.
Okay.
So the argumentative strategy you employed seemed to me that you started from this more legal perspective and provided this overview of these guideline documents that talk of trustworthy AI, and then you try to provide the conceptual grounding for how we can make sense of it. And I was wondering, from a normative point of view, what you would say to people saying, well, why care? I mean, why can't we go with trust in human-human relations and just go with reliance and consider things like technical safety, ethical issues aside from this notion of reliability? Because I mean, when I'm speaking of my laptop or my car or whatever, the coffee machine, I wouldn't bother talking of trust, right? And so I was just wondering, from a normative point of view, why would you argue in the first place we need this notion of trust being applied to AI?
Yeah, thank you, Oliver, right?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you very much. This is the standard objection to this talk.
Exactly.
And the standard answer is, thank you for the question. And also the referee exactly asked this point. So that's we have one section of the paper exactly dealing with. So the idea is that, yeah, exactly the way in which the referee framed the problem, said, okay, but why we cannot enrich the notion of alliance in order to have something much more robust? Yeah, I think that it's feasible, but the reason is for what I was saying before. I don't want the notion of trust to be based just on issue pertaining to the design and the monitoring. The idea is to consider the whole life of the technology, and also the way in which the technology is embedded in the whole socio-technical system. And the main reason is also the following, because what I'm interested is, and what I will do in a few days in Crete, the conference, is to provide a perspective in which we try to talk about multi-risk. You know, it's just isolated risk. Almost always they are just cases that we find in textbook. And in reality, we have an interaction on different kinds of risk. And that's why I want to buy this perspective. So if we just focus on the design of a specific technology and we enrich the notion of robustness or reliance, it's a bit more complicated, at least conceptually, to achieve this multi-risk perspective. And also because, as I was saying before, I don't want, the reason why I don't want to have a robust notion of reliance is that I think that we need to take into account the whole cycle of the technology, and against those views which try to reduce ethics to, you know, a kind of toolbox for the people involved in the design of the technology. So that's my answer. But yeah, that's the point, because one can object and say, okay, but I can have a very robust notion of reliance, and if I do, you know, maybe I can I cover more or less the same conceptual space. Yes, it's partially true, but I think that can be a bit more complicated to justify the things that I was saying. Yeah, but you know, I don't have, you know, anything in principle against that possibility. I think it's a bit it's less feasible to the next step that I want to do. And the idea, yeah, of just focusing on the design of technology is because there are a lot of uncertainty, and which may come up. In some cases, may come up ex ante, so already at the level of design. But then, almost always, there might be some emergent risk that you haven't conceived in advance, and this is particularly true for emergent technologies. That's why sometimes we need to ex post analysis, because in that case we can see also what happened in society with the technology. And that's why also this document of the FDA and the European Union require continuous monitoring and so on. So that's the standard answer. I don't know if I convince you, but the idea is that if we make the notion of trust robust rather than the notion of reliance, we don't fall in this kind of obstacles. But in line of principle, I don't have anything against. But if you want to add,
That's fine.
oh, thank you for the.
By the way, I'm not the referee.
Yeah, that was my question. Was going to be my question because.
Question. Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate this pulling this conceptual or presenting this conceptual framework, and also picking it thoroughly apart. I'm interested a little bit relating to this last point about the risk, and maybe it's more of a question to you. Kind of to me, the way that you kind of decouple source of potential harm, what can be harm and vulnerability, provides a really helpful starting point to assess risk. And this is just more to understand it, also because I don't risk is not really put there. Do you know, first of all, do you know how this was handled in the AIF? You know, translating, because now we get this, we are presented with these risk categories, but there's not much, or at least much about the foundations of that model. Also in terms of emerging technologies, like how the adaptability to new models. I would like to, if you could, yeah, elaborate a little bit more on your perspective on that risk categorization, linking it to your these three way of calculating it or assessing it? And then also maybe if you have something, what's your thought on this risk categorization? I mean, you alluded to it being already
Okay, yes.
ambivalent, but yeah.
Yeah, no, the funny thing is that when we were writing these papers on risk in AI, you know, the very same days, you know, almost every week, stuff like that, there was a new version of the Artificial Intelligence Act. And the colleague who has the task to be weekly updated was Giacomo. And so the main task of Giacomo was, so he is really the guy to ask your question. He was really the guy that he was reading, you know, most of the updates that, you know, weekly were available. I should say that on the one hand, the Artificial Intelligence Act improved a lot. If you consider the first formulation, they were written in a very strange way, and there was no consideration of risk analysis at all. Then I should say that received some critics by scholars and people involved, and then they adjust many things. So on the one hand, there are some sections in which they admit things like vulnerabilities, exposure. You find things like that, but you find also a definition of risk as the probability of an unwanted event. Of course, these two views on risk are not one the opposite of the other. They can go together, of course. But there was no conceptualization of risk, which was the basis for the document. And then the second problem was that these determinants of risk are not being made connected with some operation. In the sense that, and also talking with some colleagues which are lawyers, they said, okay, there are some good principles in this act, but effectively, when in a court you have to implement those principles, can be quite complicated. It was saying, because there is not such there was such an attitude or guidelines to say, okay, look, in the context of medical AI, you need to need to reduce, in particular, the hazard, or in particular, you need to take into account the vulnerabilities of people and what are the vulnerabilities, what are the vulnerable people, and things like that. For instance, if we consider, as I was saying before, if we just think about, this is my example usually. If you see, minimal risk as spam filters can be considered minimal risk. Okay. Why? Because what they have in mind is, what is the association of the category of risk with the severity of risk. Usually in risk analysis, we don't do that. You can have a minimal risk regarding, potentially extremely negative consequence, but vice versa. You can have a very high risk of, a negligible negative conditions. And you don't have exactly there here. And the idea of using labels for minimal, limited, high, doesn't convey any idea regarding what there is inside the box. If you have a way to manage the different kind of risk based on the exposure, the vulnerabilities, what are the real hazards at stake, then you can provide also some potential guidelines to the governments. I don't know if it has been done purposely in this way, leaving room to national regulations. I don't know. I'm not a law expert, but what is missing is the connection between risk analysis and regulation. I must say that this connection between risk analysis and philosophy AI and the studies on AI is also lacking. There are really a few papers with a background in risk analysis apply to technology regulation. And in order to, my take is that in order to properly speak about risk, you don't need to be an expert of risk analysis, but you need to have you know how to deal with the basic notion of risk analysis. And of course, you don't blindly apply things that you adopt in another field to AI, but there are some methodologies that can be useful, it can be modified, can be applied in that context. But the good news is that during this updates of the Artificial Intelligence Act, we noticed that gradually many takes or many classical takes of risk analysis has been introjected in the updated version of the document. So now is definitely this document is the AI Act is definitely better than when the legislative process starts. But the guy who is really expert in our group about this is Giacomo. Is and he had the task to keep updated, because the risk was of sending a manuscript to a journal quoting the AI Act, and then maybe discovering the day after that the regulation was completely different. I want to say, the second question made by the reviewer actually was that, of course, we don't really want to provide direct guidance to the European Union, to the regulators. I don't know how to do that. That's not my task. I'm a philosopher. But I think that having conceptual clarity of this notion is something that pertains to philosophical work. And if there is clarity, then also, regulators can profit from this clarity, and this conceptual analysis. Thank you for.
Anyone else?